Macroeconomics studies the economic activity that occurs in an economy. To begin to understand how the macroeconomy works, we must first understand how economic activity is measured, and the most common measure is gross domestic product, or GDP. The most helpful model to visually illustrate this is the circular flow of income model, which shows the flows of inputs and outputs and the flows of income and expenditures. Households are the owners of the factors of production, FOPs, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, and they sell these inputs in resource markets in exchange for factor incomes, rent, wages, interest, and profit. If you add up the total wages, rent, interest, and profit generated in 1 year, that measures GDP using the income approach. The firms then use those FOPs to produce their output of goods and services, which they sell in the product markets. The total value of all final goods and services produced in 1 year is GDP using the output approach. Households then buy those goods and services from product markets, and their spending on this output is called household consumption expenditure, or C. If you take the value of C, then add the three injections, investment, government spending, and export spending, and then subtract import spending. That will give you the value of GDP using the expenditure approach. The circular flow of income model can help us understand the three approaches to measuring GDP. Once the value of GDP is calculated, it undergoes a lot of adjustments to help make comparisons between countries and over time. Perhaps the most common adjustment is to remove the effect of inflation, which converts it to real GDP. In economics, the word real just means adjusted for inflation. An interesting phenomenon we can observe across modern economies is that real GDP tends to experience a long-term growth trend, which economists refer to as potential output. But this long-term growth is characterized by short-term fluctuations in actual output. This is represented by a model we call the business cycle. This model shows that economic activity varies over time, experiencing growth or expansions and decline or contractions. Though the actual output varies, the trend shows an increase in potential output over time. This is due to improvements in an economy's factors of production. Economists use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, AD/AS model, to show these short-term variations in economic activity. To simplify, AD is the total expenditure in the economy, SRAS is the total output produced by the economy, and LRAS represents the economy's potential output, or full employment level of output, YFE. Any changes in AD, SRAS, or LRAS represent changes in economic activity and will have consequences for the various economic agents. For example, an increase in AD represents short-term growth, and this is often accompanied by lower unemployment, but it could lead to demand pull inflation. A decrease in SRAS represents a contraction in economic activity, which will raise the unemployment rate, and it will also create cost-push inflation. Therefore, changes in economic activity over time can be illustrated using this model. Economists do not all agree on the shape of the aggregate supply curve. This model shown here is the new classical perspective, where there is a short-run aggregate supply curve representing output in the short run, which is the period of time when resource prices, mainly wages, are fixed, and there is a long-run supply curve representing potential output in the long run, which is the period of time when wages are flexible. However, Keynesian economists represent aggregate supply as a three-part curve, a horizontal section when there is lots of spare capacity in the economy, which means AD can increase without a rise in the price level. An upward sloping section when the economy is approaching full capacity, where any increase in AD will be accompanied by a rise in the price level, and a vertical section when the economy is operating at full capacity, meaning output cannot increase any further, and any increase in AD will only cause a rise in the price level. New classical economists believe that the flexibility of input prices causes the economy to self-correct and return to full employment. However, Keynesians believe that input prices are not very flexible, so an economy can get stuck in a recession with high unemployment. Because both perspectives about aggregate supply are so different, these differences have very different implications for government policy and how or when the government should or should not intervene in the macroeconomy. Since economic activity varies over time, and these variations have serious consequences for households and businesses, governments pursue certain macroeconomic objectives to help smooth out these variations in economic activity. The main objectives are economic growth, low unemployment, and a low and stable rate of inflation. Governments have tools to help them measure the economic growth rate, unemployment rate, and inflation rate, and use this data to craft both demand-side and supply-side policies to help smooth out short-term fluctuations in economic activity and promote long-term growth. Demand-side policies shift the AD curve, while supply-side policies shift the AS curve. To add a bit more detail about the three main macroeconomic objectives, economic growth occurs in both the short-term and long-term. Short-term growth, which is represented by a rightward shift of AD, creates jobs and so lowers the unemployment rate. But it could create inflationary pressures, which shows that there can often be conflicts between these macroeconomic objectives in the short run. Long-term growth, which is represented by a rightward shift of LRAS, also creates jobs and lowers the unemployment rate. But, unlike short-term growth, it promotes price stability and eases off the inflationary pressures in the economy.